Today I am delighted to inaugurate our first episode on Israel, so you can imagine that there is a lot to say about Israel. Its geopolitics, its politics, its strategy, its creation, but the subject is vast and complex and arouses a lot of speculation. Israel and the Middle East have a lot of lessons to teach us, so we could not of course start to address the theme of Israel on our channel without talking about its birth, so this video will serve as an introduction to the subject of Israeli geopolitics. First of all, let's observe the birth of the contemporary state of Israel, then a little reminder of Palestine, Canaan. This region is in the Abrahamic traditions the Holy Land promised to the children of Israel, the Holy Land of Christianity and the Holy Land of Islam. We will not return in this video to the very rich history of this territory where civilizations are formed and deformed and where conquests, acts of bravery and blood have been shed for millennia. Provinces of the Ottoman Empire. Since the 16th century, Palestine was placed under a mandate from the British government in 1920 after the defeat of the Triplice in the First World War in the face of the agreement and in accordance with the Treaty of Sèvres. A decision confirmed by the League of Nations in 1922, in parallel had emerged in the 19th century, which is often referred to as the century of nationalisms and consciences. The modern Jewish nationalism and consciences, the modern Jewish nationalism movement, Zionism. Its founding father Theodor Herzl, Austro-Hungarian Jewish writer, author of the book The State Jewish, published in 1896, organized in 1897 in Switzerland the First Zionist Congress. He then proclaimed the final objective of Zionism is to create for the Jewish people a home in Palestine. We will not return in this video either to the Zionist movement, which still arouses fantasies and intrigues today. We will ignore its influence with the powers and the mobilization of the diaspora to carry out its project and pursue our main theme. You have understood Zionism is the ideological backbone of the creation of the State of Israel, and the nature of this state has evolved at the same time as Zionism evolves. Zionism in its first state is rather secular socializing. But it will gradually be overcome as absorbed by a more biblical reading, almost mystical, by the Jewish Zionists and Christians, mainly the fundamentalist evangelists, for whom Palestine is the cradle of the promised land of the Jewish people. Arthur Balfour, the British Prime Minister, already committed at the end of the year 1917 to create a Jewish national home. During his very famous Declaration of Balfour, which one often names like starting point of the Jewish immigration towards Palestine. At the time, Palestine was not a land without people. A majority of Arabs lived there and coexisted with minorities, especially Jews but also Christians, who had been present for millennia despite the conquests and massacres of each other. Between 1922 and 1945, for 23 years, the Jewish population rose from 84,000 to 609,000 and represented at the end of World War II 33% of the population of the Palestinian region. Now that we have posed the demographic context at the end of the Second World War, let us see the creation of the State of Israel and the Israeli-Arab wars linked to it. They will subsequently forge Israel's geopolitics. In 1947, it is the end of the British mandate. The UNO decides to share Palestine. The plan provides for the partition of mandatory Palestine into 3 entities. The creation of a Jewish state and an Arab state, while the city of Jerusalem and its inner suburbs will be placed under international control. The plan, and of course accepted by the leaders of the Jewish community in Palestine, who want a country, but is rejected by almost all of the leaders of the Arab community. It is the beginning in Palestine of the civil war between Jews and Arabs in November 1947. From May 1948, the civil war becomes an interstate war between Israel and several Arab states. It is about the Israeli war from 1948 to 1949. Simultaneously, the situation of Jews in several Arab countries worsened, following riots or openly anti-Semitic policies. As in Iraq, and of course the emigrations of Jews out of Arab countries began and further strengthens the ranks of Israel. This war, despite narrow results, will end in an Israeli victory and lays the foundations of the future Sahel army. The peace agreements leave 78% of the territory of mandatory Palestine to the Israelis. Means a gain of 22% compared to UNO forecasts. The rest is occupied respectively by Egypt in the Gaza Strip and by Transjordan in the West Bank and East Jerusalem. After the war, the Arab countries and Israel will strengthen their positions in relation to their achievements. We will ignore the Suez Crisis in '54, where the French, British and Israeli coalition overthrows Egypt militarily but loses the political battle in the face of pressure from the Americans and the USSR. There will be no gain for Israel. We will get to the heart of the subject with a little geography, to understand the Israeli geopolitics of the time and therefore that of today by definition. After the war in 1949, Israel is strengthened. Its enemies are just as much, all have militarily strengthened their borders. While Israel has three weaknesses that could render the Zionist ideal null and void in a single war. In the north, the Golan is controlled by Syria. It dominates by its position the Galilee, that is to say Israel and the plain of Damascus. On the Syrian side, it also controls most of the sources feeding the Lake of Tiberias and the Jordan. To the east, Jerusalem is under Jordanian control as well as the West Bank annexed by Jordan since 1950. To the south, the Gaza Strip is under Egyptian control, but above all the vast Sinai Peninsula is also owned by Egypt. It is a wide and flat territory perfect to dispose of many troops. The Sinai also borders the Red Sea and especially Suez, the first navigable waterway in the world. In 1956, Israel participates alongside the French and British in the assault on Suez, and it seizes Sinai before withdrawing in '57 in the face of American-Soviet pressure. We will not revisit these events. It is therefore in a heavy geopolitical atmosphere 10 years later that Israel will break the peace agreements and preventively trigger the Six-Day War, which takes place from Monday 5 to Saturday 10. June 1967. Precisely to neutralize these 3 weak points. We will ignore the purely tactical and military aspect, which is nevertheless fascinating, to focus instead on victories. Israel with this war will triple its territorial grip. Egypt loses the Gaza Strip and the Sinai Peninsula, Syria loses the Golan Heights, and Jordan loses control over the West Bank and East Jerusalem. In a week, Israel destroys its adversaries and manages to fulfill all the objectives that threatened its integrity. In 1973, the last real large-scale Israeli-Arab war took place with the Yom Kippur War. Egypt and Syria launched a surprise attack on the day of the Jewish celebration of Yom Kippur to repair the disaster of the previous war. The fighting take place around the Sinai and the Golan Heights. Israel will first retreat in shock and then rebound and find itself 40 kilometers from Damascus in Syria and 100 kilometers from Cairo in Egypt. The military aid in material from the United States allows to Israel its rapid and effective counterattack despite heavy losses. On the Arab side, it is the Soviet aid that will slow down the Israeli counteroffensive. The conflict therefore ends on a UN ceasefire. The latter, the Great War, will mobilize a total of more than 1 million men, thousands of tanks and planes. Israel will accuse 7,500 killed without counting the wounded, and like the Arab side we will count more than 20,000 killed. Let us now focus on precisely this optimization of boundaries that has been allowed. You have understood from the wars won by Israel in relation to its initial weaknesses. Israel with this last conflict will become the state that we currently know more or less. The southern border with Egypt is secure. Egypt will subsequently renounce any attack on Israel. In exchange for the Sinai which it receives, will be made with the Camp David agreements in 1978 under the aegis of the Americans, and, moreover, Egypt will open up to dialogue with the West. Something that it still retains today. It still respects the Treaty of Camp David is what he is criticized by the rest of the Arab community. In the north, Israel withdraws its troops from Syria, but no compromise is found around the issue of the Golan, which is a region then colonized with Israeli settlements. It was part of the integration strategy. A buffer zone is created and managed by the UN. Israel will finally decide to annex the Golan in 1981 against international law to secure its northern border. Israel will then take a close interest in Lebanon, a multi-religious, fragile country that will experience several civil wars. Lebanon is also home to many paramilitary groups opposed to Israel by arms such as Hezbollah, but all that we will talk about in another video. In the East, Jordan did not openly go to war and the borders do not move. Why? King Hussein is actually in open conflict with the Organization for the Liberation of Palestine (PLO), supported by Syria. This civilian war from 70 to 71 will lead King Hussein to reconsider the talks with Israel and therefore the West, which will be thing done in 1994 with the signing of peace agreements and the normalization of relations. In balance, the external threats have been neutralized and the only adjacent country, Syria, is the last country with Lebanon to a certain extent, but it depends which Lebanon. To officially oppose all of Israel now, Israel will be able to move towards a more offensive policy and carry its policy even beyond its borders. However, remains the Palestinian question that we will of course deal with in another video, with two elements that will form Palestine as we know it today: the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. And the question is complex because it is cut in two, but we will talk about all this in a dedicated video of course. Just remember that at the time Israel dominated and controlled the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. We will now take a moment to see the major diplomatic changes in Israel's relations with the outside world and mainly its allies, and we will close this video with that. First of all, Great Britain. A long history of support for Israel, as a mandatory power in Palestine from 1920 to 1948, Great Britain also hosted the Zionist movement at the origin of the foundation of the Israeli nation. The United Kingdom supported Israel in 1948, not to mention the Suez Crisis, where it was part of the trio with France and Israel for the military capture of the canal. The United Kingdom also supported Israel during the 1967 war, they supplying hundreds of tanks in particular. The United Kingdom still today has a strong relationship with the country in a geopolitical vision of opposition to Iran and Syria. It is not as strong as the American relationship, but takes advantage of its Anglo-Saxon tropism for Israel by remaining discreet enough to recover the fruits. Also comes France. It should be noted that France has been the best ally of departure from Israel for 20 years strategically, politically and militarily. Much more than the United Kingdom in retreat since the end of World War II and delegating world order to its American cousin. France will help Israel to form as a nation and to arm itself from 1948 to 1967, including nuclear weapons. France was Israel's biggest arms supplier. What will thwart this alliance is the Six-Day War launched by Israel. In 1967, de Gaulle comes to render his verdict and thus condemns the Israeli aggression with an arms embargo. Franco-Israeli relations will not recover for a long time, and France therefore gives way to the United States. Today we necessarily think of the United States as Israel's great ally. But this, and above all, a fantasy to justify the political and military success of the country. Even if American aid is not to be minimized, it is also to be qualified. After 1945, Truman did not like the Jews. Eisenhower would strongly oppose them during the Suez Crisis. Kennedy would denounce the Israeli nuclear weapons project and support from France. Johnson would continue Kennedy's policy, and the United States would be even the collateral casualties of an Israeli missile during the Six-Day War on the USS Liberty. From 1969, Nixon continued the pressure on the Hebrew state deemed too reckless, but ultimately the realistic policy of Henry Kissinger in a context of the Cold War and the disengagement of France from Israel will open the door to the alliance that we know today. Henry Kissinger is Secretary of State of the United States, Jewish himself and above all American. He explains to Israel that the United States will not support the country, which is then in search of a Western ally, in the event of civil war, are the authors. The Yom Kippur War and the Arab offensive will pave the way for an alliance with the United States. However, again, everything is to be qualified. If Carter then proposes a pro-Israel policy, Reagan he will be clearly more distinguished and will condemn in particular the Israeli intervention in Lebanon, which he considers responsible for the massacres of Sabra and Shatila, which opens the door to the Falangist troops. Reagan will place an embargo on certain weapons intended for Israel. Then it is the same under Clinton, then under Bush, etc., etc. We must not forget either the lobbies, which is a concept rooted completely legal in American society. The American lobbies are confronting the Jewish lobbies. They themselves will confront each other on the positions of the United States vis-a-vis Israel. Once again, the question is much more complex than one would like to think. There are also cases of espionage and blackmail between countries with the support of Mossad, which we will talk about in a next video. With the archives, we now have access to many words of the President and American politicians in relation to Israel, which clearly shows the complexity of the American-Israeli relationship. To take stock of this video and of Israeli geopolitics in the 20th century, we can say that the Hebrew state fed on the errors of its adversaries with exemplary pragmatism. The country still arouses fantasies and hostilities today. Many people, but it is precisely this hostility that has often entered errors and allowed Israel to be what it has become in the 21st century, and therefore to survive. There is also a lot of talk about Israel, which is said to be a state dependent on Western powers, but in reality, and these are the facts that show it, Israel was carried by arms and the determination of the same people united around a common project. Israel certainly benefited from material aid and collaboration in all areas with France and then the United States. But let us not forget that at the same time the whole of the Arab world was also receiving aid from the USSR. In the next two videos we will close the historical loop and talk about Israel's offensive policy, its intervention in Lebanon, or the question of the Palestinian territories. Until I say a big thank you to all of you for watching this video, and see you next week.